Hello and welcome to this special edition of USISPF Conversations. And I'm delighted to be joined by Samir Lalwani of the United States Institute of Peace. Samir, thank you so much for making the time on this busy evening for you.
Yeah, it's great to be here. So I think there's a large focus, given the location in Silicon Valley, of thinking about how to link venture capital with a lot of the burgeoning industrial partnerships between defense tier one and primes and startups and sort of the government customer, but to bring capital into the mix to help sort of drive some of these innovations. There's a lot of potential there, and certainly government plays a role in that. Government capital and contracts and challenges can help prime the pump, but obviously the lifeblood of the U.S. Innovation ecosystem is private sector capital, and so that I think will be a central theme of discussion in INDUS-X.
Yeah, Samir, you've followed US-India relations for a long time. You live it both professionally and as well as personally as a member of the diaspora. But in your years of understanding US-India relations, this is sort of this epochal moment because ISET came about a few years ago, the Initiative for Critical Emerging Technology, and through that INDUS-X, which was launched a little last year during Prime Minister Modi's historical state visit. So in all your years of looking at US-India relations, what was the evolution in thinking that got us to where we are?
So I think the evolution has been in both sides starting to listening to each other's demand signals, right? So I think the basic story, and my colleague Vikram Singh and I wrote about this back in February, is that for the longest time, India had this demand signal for a high technology partnership. And there were several efforts and iterations of the US trying to bring that to the table, but they were never wide enough in scope or satisfying, or the relationship was not mature enough for that process. And simultaneously on the US side, the demand signal to India has been greater operational cooperation, coordination, such that producing defense capabilities also results in co-producing security. And so I think we have started to have a meeting of the minds between the two sides where as we incrementally move forward on both the defense technology partnership, you start to see the defense operational cooperation moving forward simultaneously. And as that trust built up with both sides, I think that we were willing to make greater investments and take greater risks. And so you saw ISET get launched, and then from that was begat INDUS-X. And the INDUS-X effort has sort of had like really high profile projects like the GE jet engines and the MQ-9B UAVs, coupled with a lot of sort of Indian inputs and innovations. But you also see a lot of bottom-up efforts, as we discussed, with sort of joint challenges, partnerships, and industrial partnerships between U.S. and Indian startups and small medium enterprises that are innovating in different ways than we have traditionally done. But that I think is the demand for both defense systems really are seeking that.
Silicon Valley is codified as startup capital of the world, the place that produces tech. There is this nexus that we're seeing right now where at one point, the Bay Area was seen as far away from Washington, far away from Wall Street, very different. But that's now being center stage in Washingtonian conversation of national security. So even for Silicon Valley, a place that's used to disruption and innovation, this is sort of new for it in some ways too, right?
It is. I think it's Silicon Valley has come a long way though over the last decade, from the period of time when I think large number of entrepreneurs and VCs were really hesitant to engage in the defense deep tech dual use space, in part because there's a lot of money to be made in other enterprises, other types of investments. There's sort of like a higher yield and shorter timeframes, but also because there are a lot of risks that come with playing with the government. The government wasn't an easy partner to work with. There was like really clunky procedures. Export controls is always sort of a challenge to navigate. That sort of limits and stifles your potential markets and exports. But I think there has been an evolution over time. I think some of that is the U.S. Sort of the government's adapting, right? So innovative in institutions like the Defense Innovation Unit. In India, it's in IDEX. So you have institutional innovations on the one hand, and then coupled with an appreciation of an external challenge that I think has really focused a lot of minds on the problem set, and that is the rise of China, and not just the rise of China in the abstract or as sort of in terms of increasing economic size or market share, but the aggressive and coercive behavior of the Chinese government and the PRC towards its neighbors, towards friends and allies of the United States, towards India, for that matter. So the large Indian diaspora has now become a little more aware of that challenge that China poses, and has sort of focused the mind on coming up with solutions. And obviously, one of the U.S. competitive strategies is our technology sector, is our ability to innovate at scale, to our software supremacy. And so those are all the things that Silicon Valley is not just nice to have, but really needed. So you saw government reaching to Silicon Valley more proactively, trying to adapt our procedures, our contracting authorities in a way to better fit the needs of Silicon Valley. And at the same time, an appreciation in the Valley for the needs of government and the United States, or the shared interest in a national cause. And so I think great power competition that has started taking root in Silicon Valley as well. You see it, for example, in sectors that we wouldn't traditionally think of as being competitive, like in chips and sort of the regulations and challenges that NVIDIA is facing. That's also bringing home to roost the problem that we have of dealing with a competitor that is looking to acquire technologies to advance their military machine and compete directly with U.S. national security interests. So I think that has started to really sink in, and you see a lot of innovators wanting to be a part of solutions to that challenge, to leverage their capabilities, their ingenuity, their capital to kind of find solutions to those problems. I mean, I'd add also, while we're going here for a second, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine also brought home the first two myths, let's say. The first is that great power politics is not going to result in actual sort of brute force and violence, and clearly it did, and to much the horror of the world. And the second was the assumption that tech and software engineers couldn't really play a consequential role in that world, and clearly the Ukrainians' ability to innovate with novel sort of software solutions to fairly generic commercial technology, I think is what has kept it in the game, and that has become an inspiration that actually Silicon Valley that can be a real asset in competition with Russia or China or other national security challenges the U.S. faces.
Sorry, beg your pardon. On that note of Silicon Valley, you see venture capitals and startups that, or anyone in the private sector normally looked at US-India relations or any geopolitical relations as something for Washington and Delhi, or Washington and the capital. This was seen as something for bureaucrats and ministers and secretaries. But now what we're seeing with INDUS-X is we're getting these startups, these VC firms, these accelerators, these private sector companies, these chip and space companies to the table to meet with key decision makers. So in some ways, they are playing their own little part in writing a very important part of the national security doctrine and a very important part of the security strategic partnership.
Yeah, I would characterize it a little bit differently, which is that there was always a puzzle in the U.S.-India relationship. I think the U.S.-India relationship in sort of technology sector had already taken off in the 1990s. You saw this with the engineering communities that were leveraged to deal with Y2K, with sort of more and more Indian diaspora in Silicon Valley, sort of moving beyond the Intels and IBMs to start their own firms, or in the semiconductor industry and chip design. So we were already accelerating the relationship in that sector. It just hadn't crossed over into the more regulated defense dual use space. And there was always this question of why can't the US and India do defense technology together or space technology together when they can do it so well when it comes to IT services or software as a service. So I think it's in a way the government is catching up to what Silicon Valley had already figured out a long time ago, is that we can co-innovate and co-develop together. It requires navigating some challenging bureaucratic hurdles that are there for a good reason, right? We don't want to just have sort of no barriers to entry when it comes to some of the most sensitive technologies that can be quite harmful and destructive, or really sort of safeguard our national security interests. But we can figure out a way to leverage the natural partnerships we've had, particularly on the engineering and science and R&D side, and bring that into fields that have thus far been closed off, and find ways to come up with solutions that are satisfying to both. And you're seeing it, for example, I'll give one example is in the space industry. I mean, there's just such a demand for commercial space technology that is being led by the U.S. government, the U.S. Space Force. And so I think we're going to see a lot more, particularly in that sector in the coming years.
Samir, since you touched on space, got to ask you right now, with increased privatization of space startups and space in the industry, and we've seen the U.S. prioritize it on the national security side with the Space Force. Is space the final frontier right now?
I don't know if it's the final frontier. I think it is the next frontier, let's say, between the U.S. and India. I think the U.S., the Pentagon has come out with a commercial space strategy that really requires leveraging as much a commercial augmentation as possible, both for resilience and redundancy, but also sort of diversification of sources of support that really then counters the challenge, counters adversary efforts to defeat our sort of space-based communications, intelligence, surveillance, other assets. So it's really turning to partners in other countries. And India is rapidly innovating. It has a lot of success, both in the public sector and ISRO, which was a remarkable success in its own right, but then now opening up to the private sector, even before other parts of the defense industry. So you have a lot of, frankly, like former ISRO engineers who started their own companies. They're doing great, novel, cutting-edge work in hyperspectral, in algorithms that merge different data streams, putting sort of new forms of satellite launch, cheaper launch options, space domain awareness. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for the United States to leverage it simply for commercial reasons, but increasingly that'll, I think, open the scope to other kinds of cooperation, human flight cooperation. Obviously, India signed the Artemis Accords. I think there's sort of new scientific discussions taking place coming that are supported by Space Command, but also by the National Science Foundation, that will really open the aperture or widen the aperture for the kinds of space-based cooperation. So I'd say it's the first frontier of many frontiers to come in at least in sort of the U.S.-India space cooperation.
Samir, Lalwani, thank you so much for the time. Go well.